Hello everyone, welcome to part 2 of Will Your Machine Survive a Descale? Originally I didn't intend on there being a part 2, but I discovered some things that either didn't get mentioned or at least explored enough. I also didn't want to give any false hopes, as even though the conclusions were pretty grim in that part, and you're probably hoping for some better news right now, things do get worse. So before we move on, let's recap on what we learned from part 1. First, we looked at a couple of reasons why you should descale, namely the inlet port does tend to build up and get blocked. Then we took a look at the role the water level probes play inside the boiler. We did a lot of testing of some old probes, and we found out that many were that bad that not only would they fail during a descale, but they were also failing just by getting wet. We also found out that if we soaked them overnight in fresh water, then this would improve them quite a lot. But once they were introduced to descale solution, the failure rate went right back up. And finally, I showed how brand new probes were still working fine under the same tests. The conclusion was to either replace your probes or measure the quality or amount of resistance of your probes before doing a descale. And then, a week or so after finishing this video, I was descaling a machine for a customer when I noticed that the shiny new probes I'd just installed failed on me. Disaster! Now what do we do? Well, we'll look into why that happened a little later in this video. So let's take a look at what we're going to cover today. First, I just want to expand further on part 1 where we looked at how soaking the probes overnight did improve them. We found that fresh water worked to some extent, but it wasn't enough to give any kind of guarantee, as we later found out that most of those failed again once they became contaminated with descale solution. So I was looking for a better solution than just say buy new ones, as in a lot of countries these are difficult to get a hold of and can be very expensive to ship. So I tried a bunch of different chemicals to soak them in overnight, and after this I soaked them again in fresh water for a few hours to rinse them off. I also replaced all the seals in them. I took readings before and after the process, and I'm sorry to say, but they all made them worse, except for Vinegar, which seemed to provide some sort of improvement, but it still wasn't enough to give us any kind of assurance. So what if yours measures 5 or even 10 megaohms? Would they be okay? In the first video I measured them cold and outside the boiler, but I've since found out that this can be very misleading. And to prove this, I took some probes that fared quite well last time and measured them at around about 13 megaohms. You'll remember from part 1 that on this model of machine, the point where the water is determined, we'll call this the detection point, is anything below 1.3 megaohms. So 13 meg seems well above that range and shouldn't cause us any issues. So I installed them, I went into debug mode and we warmed up the machine. Once it was heated up, I drained out water for about 5 seconds while looking at the AD count on the high probe. The AD count for no water is anything above 1880, and you can see that these levels have dropped below that. This means the boiler has no idea I've just emptied a centimetre or 2 of water from it, and I could continue to drain this now and it wouldn't know. It would just keep on heating up until the thermal fuse blew. So for now anyway, I can't think of anything you can use that will substitute buying new ones. If you find anything that works, then please leave a comment to let me know below. So with that, let's assume your probes have passed all these tests or you've just fitted some brand new ones. Will you now be confident enough to pass the descale test? Well, I certainly thought I was, until I realised another big factor at play here, and that is which chemical you decide to use, as they all have different effects on how your machine detects water. To demonstrate this, I simulated the descale procedure by refilling the boiler with 4 different products and letting them heat up to around 80 degrees Celsius, which is around what most of the machines run at during this process. But before we start this experiment, let's first take a look at what a perfect test would look like. I've just fitted this machine with brand new probes. And we'll do this test with just plain water so that you can see what the ideal reading should be. And there you can see it's gone well above the 1880 detection point and right up to the max, which is around 2800. Okay, so let's start with vinegar. We'll use a 50-50 mix, which is what most people recommend. I don't recommend you using vinegar anyway, especially on these dual boiler machines, as these only run through a single rinse cycle, which is nowhere near enough to remove the smell. I've completely drained the boiler already, so we are now letting it fill up again with the vinegar mix. Now it's reached about the right temperature, I'm going to do the usual test by draining the boiler for 5 seconds to see what effect it has on the sensors. You can see as the water drops below the sensor, the reading fluctuates between 1900 and 2300, which is technically okay, and you'll most likely be fine if you have the dual boiler or non-touch version, as if you remember on those the detection point's a lot lower. But on this particular model where the detection point is so high, it will be too risky in my opinion, given that these probes are brand new. Okay, next up is citric acid. And the recommended dose for this is 2 tablespoons per litre. And you can see as I drop the water on this one that it goes up to around about 2700, which is almost the max. So citric acid seems like a pretty good choice. Next up is sulfamic acid. I'm using a 15 gram dose for this, which is equivalent to 1 heaped teaspoon. This is a very effective descaler and often used in commercial environments, but you'll see shortly why you should never use it on one of these machines. While the boiler is filling up still, it's already messing with the sensor. In fact, the boiler doesn't even fill up fully before the machine stops the pump. So sulfamic acid gets a big fail. Finally, we have Breville's own product, and in keeping with their usual definite article syndrome, they call this the descaler. It's made up of a mix of 3 ingredients: malic acid, sulfamic acid, which as you've seen is very dangerous to use by itself, and finally a small amount of citric acid. I've let this one get a little too hot, but if I let some water out, you can see the reading goes up to where we saw the plain water reach, which is great. So that's about it for part 2. So let's go over what we've learned from these results. We know that it's either impossible or very difficult to refurbish old sensors fully. We learned that vinegar is not a good product to use on these machines. We also found out that sulfamic acid completely confuses the sensors and should be avoided at all costs. And then finally we found that Breville's own product, at least the one I have here anyway, performed very well with brand new probes. Although the ingredients were quite non-specific, so if you were to get one with say 30% sulfamic, then I'm guessing, going by my results anyway, that this would greatly increase the risk. So after going through all this, are we any more confident about descaling these machines? Well, sadly no, at least with this model anyway. The margin for error on these earlier touch models is just too small, and the consequences are just too high. As you're looking at a $500 repair bill at least, or a lot more if the element gets too hot and burns out. So not wanting to leave on such a big downer, I had a thought come to me while I was writing this. Could we run a descale with the boiler turned off? It doesn't need to be that hot anyway to remove calcium, and this would vastly reduce any risk of contamination, as this comes mostly from the steam, and it would also eliminate any risk of the boiler overheating. As I don't have one of these machines in right now, I'm going to save that for part 3. I know there are ways to manually descale some models, but it's a bit of a faff, and I think if we can just have a simple switch on the steam boiler, then this would be a lot easier. Who knows, if it works, maybe Breville could update the firmware on these models so they don't heat up. Or maybe I'm not thinking this through and I'm missing something more obvious. If so, then let me know below. But for now, thanks for watching.